Maximum security prison life. Shocking stories from inside ADX Florence. The silence behind steel doors. The night air in southern Colorado carried an unusual stillness. Snow dusted the desert plains, shimmering under the harsh beams of prison floodlights. From a distance, the structure looked less like a penitentiary and more like a military fortress planted in the middle of nowhere. Locals called it the clean version of hell, but the world knew it by another name, ADX Florence, the most secure prison in the United States. Every wall of ADX was built to suffocate hope. Cells were poured from concrete, doors sealed with steel, windows so narrow an inmate could barely glimpse the sky. Inmates spent 23 hours a day alone, locked inside what was essentially a concrete box. The place was designed not just to cage men but to erase them. Yet inside those walls not every man was erased. Some refused to disappear. Marcus, the butcher, Delgado lay motionless on his cot, his eyes fixed on the hairline cracks in the ceiling above. He had been at ADX for 7 years, ever since a bloody massacre in El Paso cemented his reputation as one of the cartel's most merciless killers. He had expected the isolation to gnaw at him, to strip him down until he was hollow. Instead, it had sharpened him. The butcher was patient. He could wait as long as it took. 2 tiers away, Leon Bishop tried to quiet the constant buzz of fluorescent lights in his head. Bishop wasn't like the others. His crimes weren't written in blood, but in numbers, forged ledgers, phantom accounts, fraudulent investments. At his peak, he had yachts in Monaco and mansions in Miami. Now, he lived inside a box with a stainless steel toilet and a narrow slab for a bed. Unlike Delgado, Bishop was unraveling. He scribbled endlessly in the margins of old legal documents, equations and notes no one would ever read. He and Delgado should have remained strangers. But in Florence, isolation had a way of bending the rules. Even silence could be breached if you knew how. It began with something subtle, a tray. Each day, meals were delivered on foam trays pushed through the slot of the steel door. Delgado had long since stopped tasting the food, but he had discovered the trays could carry something more valuable than nourishment. Using a tiny scrap of metal he had filed down over months, he carved a message so faint it could only be seen under the right angle of light. The tray was collected by kitchen staff, scrubbed and shuffled back into circulation. Hours later, when Leon Bishop slid his dinner into the shadows, he noticed the scratches. The words chilled him. Money buys silence. Silence buys freedom. Bishop reread it a dozen times that night. Why him? Why would a butcher of men reach out to a disgraced financier? He wanted to ignore it. He wanted to toss the tray away and forget it existed. But the idea burrowed under his skin. Freedom. That single word was intoxicating. 2 weeks later, guards stormed Bishop's cell. They ripped apart his mattress and emerged with a sharpened piece of metal. Contraband. A weapon. Bishop's protests were frantic, his voice cracking as he swore he had been framed. The officers didn't believe him, of course. To them, every inmate was guilty twice over. When Bishop was finally returned to his cell, he collapsed on his cot, seething. Then came another tray. Another message. You owe me now. It was Delgado's way of chaining him, of forcing him into an alliance he had never wanted. The transformation was immediate. Bishop stopped scribbling nonsense equations and started listening. He pressed his ear to the vents. He whispered into the pipes. He followed Delgado's instructions like scripture. Soon, others began to join in. Men from rival gangs, domestic terrorists, even the loners who had no allegiance. Delgado was pulling invisible strings across Florence, and somehow no one outside the cells noticed. No one but Officer Ramirez. Ramirez had worked corrections long enough to recognize when the quiet wasn't right. Most guards relied on Florence's reputation, the unbreakable prison. But Ramirez had seen too many systems fail. He remembered the Oklahoma City bomber confined here, the 9/11 conspirators, the mob bosses. Florence was where the government buried its most dangerous secrets. Men like Delgado weren't supposed to have voices here. And yet, Ramirez kept catching glimpses. A folded corner of toilet paper passed through the bars too quickly. Inmates tapping on walls with patterns too deliberate to be random. Bishop, once pale and broken, now looking back at him with a strange, steady calm. Something was happening. It escalated on a Tuesday morning. An inmate in the recreation cage attacked a guard, slashing at him with a sharpened toothbrush. The alarm blared, boots thundered through the corridors, and the attacker was dragged away in chains. Everyone assumed it was another pointless act of rage. But when Ramirez replayed the camera feed, his stomach turned. The attacker hadn't gone wild. He had looked directly into the lens before striking. He had wanted to be caught. The search of his cell confirmed Ramirez's fear. Hidden under the thin mattress was a crude sketch of the prison. Not the cells, not the yard, but the staff wing. It was a map that pointed to a weakness, one no inmate should have known. By nightfall, a rumor spread through the guard ranks like wildfire. Had someone inside been leaking information? Was there a mole among the staff? Supervisors brushed it off, claiming it was exaggerated. But Ramirez couldn't sleep. He knew what he saw. And he wasn't the only one who couldn't sleep. In Bishop's cell, a new note lay hidden in the folds of his blanket. Delgado's unmistakable hand, carved in jagged strokes. Tomorrow the silence breaks. The day the silence broke. The morning after the cryptic message, ADX Florence awoke to the same sterile routine it had known for decades. Doors clanged open for meal delivery, cameras buzzed silently from every corner, and guards moved with practiced precision. To the outside world nothing had changed. But inside, something invisible stirred, a pulse, an undercurrent of dread. Officer Ramirez felt it the moment he stepped onto the tier. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it was there, in the way inmates stared too long, in the eerie quiet that followed his footsteps. Ramirez had learned long ago that prisons had moods, almost like living organisms. Today ADX felt restless. In his cell, Marcus, the butcher, Delgado sat on the edge of his cot, muscles taut as wire. He had lived half his life waiting for moments like this. Every message scratched onto trays, every whisper through pipes, every staged attack had led to this day. He closed his eyes and mouthed the words, "Ahora empieza, now it begins." Leon Bishop, meanwhile, hadn't slept. The financier's nerves were frayed, his palms clammy. Delgado's last note repeated in his mind like a curse. Tomorrow the silence breaks. Bishop wanted out of the plan, out of the alliance, out of the concrete tomb he had been shoved into. But there was no way out. He was bound, trapped by the same silence that Delgado was about to shatter. At 10:14 a.m., the first breach of silence came not from a scream or an alarm, but from a flicker. One of the prison's camera feeds cut to static, then returned. To most of the staff it was a minor glitch. To Delgado it was the signal. Within seconds the prison shifted. An inmate in the medical wing collapsed, convulsing violently. Nurses rushed in, guards trailing behind. The scene was chaotic, urgent, but it was a distraction. While staff clustered around the medical emergency, another inmate, previously thought to be sedated, slipped something from beneath his sleeve. A folded scrap of plastic, sharpened to a point. He pressed it against the vent grill, scraping rhythmically, sending vibrations down the pipes. The vibrations reached Delgado. In his cell, Delgado smiled. It was working. He knelt beside the drain and whispered back. His words carried along the plumbing like veins in the body of the prison. The message traveled, short, coded, untraceable. Phase 2. At the same time, Leon Bishop found himself sweating under the glare of two guards. They had chosen him for a random cell search. His books were tossed onto the floor, papers rifled through, bedding shaken out. Bishop's heart pounded as one officer lifted his thin mattress. For a moment, he thought it was over, that the note Delgado had left would be discovered. But the guard moved on, uninterested in a crumpled scrap of fabric clinging to the underside of the cot. When they left, Bishop sank to his knees, relief flooding him. But then he noticed the note was gone. Someone had taken it. Meanwhile, in the control room, Ramirez stared at the monitors, his unease growing with every passing second. The glitch earlier had been too precise. And now, another oddity, two guards hadn't reported back after a routine sweep near the staff wing. Radio calls went unanswered. Supervisors dismissed it as interference, but Ramirez wasn't buying it. He pulled up the feed from that corridor, scanning frame by frame. And then he saw it. One of the guards looked directly into the camera, just for a split second. His face pale, his lips moving silently. Ramirez rewound, zoomed, read his mouth. The guard was whispering one word. Help. A chill stabbed through Ramirez's spine. Something was happening from the inside out. By noon, Florence had become a hive of controlled panic. Supervisors ordered lockdown procedures, slamming steel doors and sealing entire wings. Inmates were trapped in their cells, but Delgado was unbothered. He had expected this. He had built his plan around it. Because his goal was never escape, was control. Through Bishop's financial networks, Delgado had learned of vulnerabilities, offshore accounts tied to contractors, bribes funneled quietly into construction firms. The flaw in ADX's design wasn't just physical. It was financial, bureaucratic, corrupt. Delgado had used Bishop's expertise to expose the cracks, and now he was turning them into weapons. The weak point near the staff wing wasn't a tunnel or a broken lock. It was a supply corridor widened during a recent renovation. Delgado's messages had revealed every inch of it. And now, an accomplice, a former cartel affiliate working as a civilian contractor, had smuggled in something far more dangerous than a shank or a map. A phone. As alarms echoed and wings sealed shut, Delgado crouched by the vent, listening. From somewhere deep in the prison, faint but unmistakable, came the buzz of a hidden ringtone. To anyone else it was background noise. To Delgado it was victory. The phone was live. And on the other end wasn't another inmate. It was someone outside. For the first time in years, Delgado spoke words not confined to Florence's concrete walls. "Está listo?" he whispered into the vent. "Are you ready?" The answer came back, distorted but clear enough. "It begins tonight." Bishop, huddled in his cell, pressed his palms against the walls as if he could melt through them. He realized now the truth. Delgado wasn't planning a prison break. He was orchestrating something far larger. Florence wasn't the escape. Florence was the command center. And Bishop, whether he liked it or not, had become the banker of a storm that was about to erupt. As evening settled, Ramirez prepared for his shift change, but he couldn't let go of the whispers clawing at his mind. He reviewed the guard's silent plea again and again. Something inside told him this wasn't about a single riot or an inmate uprising. It was about the system itself, and the possibility that ADX Florence, the fortress designed to be unbreakable, had already been broken from within. The last thing Ramirez saw before leaving the control room was another flicker on the cameras. This time, 3 feeds cutting out in unison. Not a glitch. A signal. And miles away, beyond the snow and concrete, an SUV rolled quietly down a dirt road, headlights off, tires crunching against frozen gravel. Inside were men who didn't look like convicts or guards, but their purpose was written in their silence. They weren't coming to break someone out. They were coming to take something in. The fortress wasn't keeping danger out anymore. It was inviting it in. When the fortress trembled, darkness fell over Florence, Colorado, swallowing the prison in a blanket of shadow. The Rockies loomed in the distance like jagged black teeth, and the desert plains stretched silent under the weight of night. Floodlights around the compound flickered against the snow, and inside the walls, a storm of fear brewed. For decades, ADX had been a symbol of certainty. Politicians, prosecutors, even foreign governments rested easier knowing the monsters of the world were buried here. Terrorists, mob bosses, cartel assassins. Men too dangerous for ordinary prisons. The fortress had one purpose: to silence them. But tonight, the silence didn't feel like control. It felt like a countdown. Officer Ramirez knew it. His gut screamed with every step he took down the narrow tier. He had replayed the clues over and over in his head. The staged stabbing, the contraband maps, the whisper of help from a guard's lips, the synchronized camera blackouts. The system didn't glitch like that. The system didn't bleed like that. Something bigger than a riot was coming. In his cell, Marcus, the butcher, Delgado sat perfectly still, as if meditating. His broad shoulders were relaxed, but his eyes gleamed with fire. For years, Florence had tried to strip him of power. Yet power had a way of seeping through cracks. Delgado had found those cracks, and tonight, he was ready to make the world listen. Leon Bishop, meanwhile, was unraveling. Sweat drenched his shirt, his chest heaving as he crouched in the corner. He wasn't built for this. The chaos, the violence, the whispers of blood. Delgado had forced him into the plan, but Bishop's mind was racing. Offshore accounts, encrypted transfers, laundering routes, he had given Delgado access to it all. Not for escape, but for leverage. And now, the realization clawed at him. ADX Florence wasn't the prison anymore. It was headquarters. At 8:47 p.m., the first explosion rattled the compound. It wasn't inside the cell blocks but outside the perimeter, a car in the staff lot igniting in a ball of fire. Sirens wailed instantly, guards scrambled, and floodlights snapped toward the smoke. But this too was part of the plan. As the chaos outside swallowed attention, the inside began to fracture. 3 camera feeds died simultaneously. Locks on 2 staff-only corridors failed. Doors that should have stayed sealed clicked open. And in those moments, Delgado's plan shifted from whispers in the vents to action in the halls. Ramirez sprinted to the control room, shouting for a full lockdown. His voice cracked with urgency, but the supervisors hesitated. It's just a distraction, one argued. No one gets out of their cells. But Ramirez knew better. This wasn't about inmates running wild. This was about precision. About power. About Delgado. Down the tier, Delgado leaned close to the drain in his floor. A faint vibration thrummed back, the secret signal they had practiced for months. He whispered one word, "Aura." "No." And then the impossible happened. From the staff wing, two masked figures emerged, not inmates but outsiders. Dressed in stolen uniforms, they moved with lethal precision. They weren't here to rescue Delgado. They weren't here for Bishop. They were here for something hidden deeper. Documents, digital files, evidence stored in the administrative wing. Delgado had orchestrated it all, not for freedom but for leverage. The fortress wasn't meant to keep him in. It was meant to keep his secrets out. As alarms shrieked, Ramirez locked eyes with the monitors. His blood ran cold. The intruders weren't headed for the cells. They were headed for the data servers. Years of intelligence, testimonies, and federal secrets were stored in Florence. Confessions from cartel bosses, wiretaps from terrorist cells, and names of informants buried in protective custody. If Delgado's men got to that information, the outside world would bleed. Ramirez grabbed his radio, barking orders. "Seal the staff wing. Now." But static hissed back. The comms had been jammed. On the floor below, Bishop heard footsteps echoing closer. His stomach twisted. Delgado had promised him survival, wealth, even influence. But now he saw the truth. Delgado's game wasn't about survival. It was about domination. If those files were taken, entire governments could be blackmailed. People would die. Innocents. And Bishop realized something even darker. He had been Delgado's test run. His offshore knowledge had been just the beginning. The banker had become expendable. With shaking hands, Bishop tore a piece of paper from one of his legal briefs. Using a pencil stub, he scrawled two words, "Don't trust." He shoved it into the vent, praying it would reach someone, anyone, before it was too late. Meanwhile, Delgado rose from his cot, pacing slowly. His lips curled into a smirk as he whispered to himself, "They thought they buried me. Tonight they'll see who's really in the ground." In the control room, Ramirez made a desperate choice. He yanked open a locked cabinet and pulled free an emergency lever, one rarely used, almost ceremonial. The lever initiated a blackout protocol, plunging half the prison into darkness. The theory was simple: strip intruders of visibility. But Ramirez knew it came with a price. Guards were now blind too. The prison descended into chaos. Flashlights cut through smoke, radios crackled with panic, and sirens wailed in the distance. Somewhere in that darkness, Delgado's allies moved like shadows, closer to their prize. And then came the second explosion. This time inside. A blast rocked the administrative wing, shattering reinforced glass and setting papers aflame. Guards stumbled through smoke as masked figures pushed deeper, dragging bags of hard drives, files, and secured evidence. Delgado hadn't escaped, but his reach had just torn through the heart of the fortress. In his cell, Bishop pressed his head against the cold concrete, whispering, "God help us." He understood now. Delgado didn't need to walk free. He could run the world from inside a box. Ramirez, coughing through smoke, pushed toward the blast zone, weapon drawn. His flashlight beam caught movement, one of the masked men sprinting with a case clutched tight. Ramirez fired, the shot echoing like thunder through the prison. The figure fell, the case skidding across the floor. For a heartbeat, everything froze. Delgado heard the gunshot echo through the vents. He closed his eyes, inhaling deeply. He knew what had been risked, what had been lost, and what had been gained. He didn't need to see the outcome to know one truth. Florence was no longer unbreakable. And as the flames licked higher, a new silence fell. Not the silence of control, not the silence of defeat. The silence of fear. Because if Marcus Delgado could orchestrate this from the belly of the most secure prison in America, then the world outside wasn't safe anymore. By dawn, the smoke had thinned and Florence was scarred but still standing. Federal reinforcements flooded the compound, sealing every gate, every corridor, every vent. Reporters circled outside the perimeter, their voices trembling as they announced the unthinkable. The most secure prison in the United States has been breached. Inside, bodies were counted, files recovered, and evidence collected. Supervisors assured Washington that nothing critical had been taken, that the system had held, that the fortress had endured. But Ramirez wasn't convinced. He had seen the masked intruders with his own eyes. He had seen what they carried. And when he opened the recovered case, his blood ran cold. It was empty. Somewhere in the chaos, Delgado's allies had switched the cases. The hard drives, the names, the confessions, they were gone. The fortress had been looted under their noses. Ramirez stormed down the tier, slamming his fist against the steel of Delgado's cell. "What did you take?" he shouted, his voice raw. Delgado rose slowly from his cot, eyes gleaming in the dim light. He stepped closer to the slot in the door, his smile faint but deadly. "What did I take?" he whispered. "Nothing. I only reminded them how weak they are." He leaned forward, lowering his voice until Ramirez could barely hear. "Today Florence bet. Tomorrow Washington breaks." Ramirez's stomach nodded. He knew then that this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. And somewhere else, far beyond the walls of Colorado, a laptop flickered to life in a dark room. Files opened one by one. The names of witnesses, the coordinates of safe houses, the bank accounts of men who thought themselves untouchable. Marcus Delgado hadn't escaped Florence. Florence had escaped with him.